Welcome to the MenTell Health Podcast. I'm Tim. I invite you on my journey to talk about men's mental health. Before we begin, as always, a brief disclaimer. I am in no shape or form a mental health professional. I'm just a bloke who wants people to get talking about men's mental health. Any resources I've used to come up with the facts and statistics, whatever I say in the episode, will be either in the show notes or in the description below, depending on which medium you're using to consume this content. In today's episode, I will be talking about men and emotions. Do they have any? And if so, where? Spoiler alert, yes, we do. I would like this to start this episode with a quote which I found beautiful because it says everything that I'm going to say. So if you only want to listen for 2 minutes, which I hope you don't, because, please, it would be great if you'd listen to the entire episode. But if you want to just get the quick info, this is the quote. The quote is by Daphne Rose Kingma from her book The Men We Never Knew, in which they talk about the myth that men are unfeeling, that creates damaging relationship problems because we've dismissed men as the feelingless gender. We've given up on them because of the way boys are socialized. Their ability to deal with emotions has been systematically undermined. Men are taught, point by point, not to feel, not to cry, and not to find words to express themselves. And these gender stereotypes that men have no feelings, that men have no emotions, or that there's a big difference in emotions and expressiveness between the genders. They're some of the most robust stereotypes we have worldwide. Obviously, from my own experience, I can only talk about the Western, Central European world, but it's definitely very big here. And from media that I consume, I can tell that it's also in other areas, definitely in the Western world. And there is very little research, actually, that supports this idea. There's some bloggers who talk about the caveman and how they need their cave and how they actually is better off without feelings. But, not every blogger should be believed and trusted in what they say. But as with, when we talk about feelings and emotions, obviously there's an emotion, there's a biological side to it, and then there's a social side to it. And especially in the biological side, but also very in the social side, I'm going to use very binary terms, male and man and woman, where I'm talking mostly about the biological or socialized as these sexes / genders. And as someone much wiser than me has said, as always, there's more variation within the group than there's difference between the groups, if that makes sense to you. If not, just ask me again to explain it, but I hope it makes sense. Yes. Now, when we look at the biological side, yes, men and women's brains are different. And in a recent study where there have been over 900 MRIs taken from people of a variety of ages and genders, they have discovered that the interconnectiveness between our left and our right hemisphere in our brain, so the communication between them, is a lot more dominant in the brains of women. So there's a lot more communication happening between the left and the right side of the brain. And those researchers say or concluded that because we process emotions in one area and we process speech in another area, the lack of interconnectedness of the brains in men could be a reason why men struggle to communicate their feelings better, because when you feel something but the information is not very quickly or coherently transported with the side of the brain that processes a way of communicating that, then obviously you have a difficulty there. Whereas in brains of women, those connectiveness is much stronger. So when they feel something, the side of the brain that processes speech and that can then talk about their feelings, that they can express what the other side of the brain experiences or is processing right now much quicker and better and more coherently. Definitely more coherently than I can present the results of the study, apparently. Oopsie. So yeah, biologically, women are designed better to talk about their emotions and their feelings. But don't stop watching now because you feel like you've been confirmed in your belief that men either have no or cannot talk about their feelings. Because as with everything, biology is only one small part of the story. Our biology, of course, does something to us, but social does way more, because our brains and our biology is quite often shaped by our experiences. And a great example of this is how we read, as in letters and books and newspapers and stuff like that, because reading is something that we've created ourselves. It's not biologically made. There was never like a thing that we were evolved into being able to read, but we started to write and then learned to read, more or less. And there's this great book by and I'm totally going to mispronounce their name, so I'm very sorry, Stanislav Dehaene, I think they're called, and it is called Reading in the Brain. And in that book they talk about how an area back here in the brain that is was used for analyzing visual signs in nature has been changed into being able to read. So we evolved our own brain to do something that it wasn't meant to do. So just as a little side note on how, just because something is biologically in that way, it doesn't mean it defines us. It just gives us certain predispositions, but that doesn't mean that they're going to have to be the determining factors of how we live our lives. Sometimes they are very much so, and there's very little we can do about it. In other areas, there's a lot we can do about it. And even the researchers of the study say that there is a great deal of variation between individuals. Different fiber pathways configurations don't necessarily predestine someone to behave or think a certain way. And obviously some of these studies in the past have been used a lot to give this idea that because of the different sizes of women's brains, because they're usually smaller, but then again women are just smaller, they've been been used to say that women are less capable, they're less intelligent than men, which is of course utter nonsense. And there's been Anke Erhardt, a professor at Columbia University Medical Center, has said, acknowledging brain effects by gender does not mean these are immutable, permanent determinants of behavior, but rather they may play a part within a multitude of factors and certainly can be shaped by social and environmental influences. So yes, there is a biological difference between brains of men and brains of women, but there's probably more difference between my brain and my brother's brain than there is between, generally speaking, men's brains and women's brains. So it may be harder for men to be able to talk about their emotions. It doesn't mean we can't. There's nothing actually stopping us other than society, which sucks. Because, yes, this is the other side of the coin. There's this tiny bit that's biological, and yes, there is something, but then there is this heavy, big thing, society, that just is annoying. Because from a very young age, from when we are really, really tiny, or like wee lads, as someone with a maybe Scottish accent or dialect would say, men are taught to be stoic. Men are taught to be strong. Men are taught to not feel, and if they feel, just to swallow it down, because they need to be self-sufficient, they need to be self-reliant, they need to be providers, and they need to face adversaries alone, man to man, and anything else would threaten to damage their reputation, their masculinity, threaten their status as an alpha male. And some people might say, oh yes, that old story, that's we know about that, but we're working on it. It's changing, it's not the same anymore. No way. Well, I'm not sure that's true, because if you just look at the some of the biggest selling films in the last decade, very, very, very famous and big Hollywood superhero films of a certain studio, not just the one actually, all of them, quite many of them have a hero, a big hero who saves the day, and yeah, some of them have teams, but quite many of them have this one hero in them. 80% male, 90% white, and more than 90, I guess. And they always deal with their shit by themselves. They're the saviors in the end. And when they, are beaten down, maybe there's one person that helps them. But in the end, they pick themselves up by their bootstraps, and they face their shit alone. And they don't show their feelings. Because if they show feelings, then they're vulnerable. But they're the hero by themselves. Not just by something that happened in the past, but even today, in our society today. Just turn on the TV, go to the cinema, and not the majority, but the big ones, the hero stories. There's actually if you are interested in creative writing or in fiction writing or in screenplay writing, there's this one storytelling technique that is called the hero's journey, and that's one person doing all that stuff by themselves. Obviously can change that, but the formula works quite often for this one specific person, quite often a man, when it comes to facing physical and societal struggles. It's women when it goes to about emotional journeys and interrelationships. Same technique of storytelling, but the man faces the baddies, and the woman faces the demons inside. Men don't have demons inside, I guess, and women can't face baddies. So yeah, so much has changed. But it's not just a pop culture that shapes us. It does play a big part, but it is also quite often our experiences in childhood. What have we experienced then? How have our parents, and in case of men, how have our fathers shared their emotions and their feelings, and taught us to share our emotions and our feelings? And if you are the child, like me most of the time, until from the age of 4 onwards, of a single female parent, how did they encourage gender stereotypes? Consciously or not consciously. Maybe to make up for the lack of a father, they didn't want you to become girly, so they, encouraged you to be manly. And boys will be boys. That beautiful Gillette ad that brings me to tears every single time. Boys will be boys. And that's how we are brought up. That's how we are shaped to fit this world. And it goes on. It's not just in that area of emotions, but also in the work environment. The successful billionaire is always one dude. The successful businessman, that's one person. But obviously it's not that one person. I mean, a billionaire cannot be a billionaire if he doesn't have people working for him. And a businessman cannot run a business that they themselves are in. I mean, of course, there's some companies there's only one person, but most of them aren't. But the success story is the one person that does it alone, and mostly the man that does it alone and that doesn't have any feelings. And because men are not taught to show their feelings, show their emotions, they channel the feelings they do have into other things. And quite often that is aggression, quite often that is tenacity towards something. Sometimes it's anger that they let out on other people, on minority groups, on countries. If, you're a certain person that feels like the West is laughing at them and not wanting to play with them. And then other big groups have to suffer a lot from that, because it is, socially more accepted for men to feel anger, pride, violence, which is weird. But it also forces men, because if you're not allowed to express your feelings, you then go and look for an outlet where it is socially acceptable, and the one of the very, very few areas where it is emotionally acceptable for men, socially acceptable for men to show and express their feelings is sports. One of the biggest ones in the world is American football and European football. Not the same sport. American football is the one where they throw and tackle. And the rest of the world is football, is the one where they kick the ball, which makes a bit more sense. I know the other one is called because the ball is a foot long, but I mean, in the metric system, it's just 33 centimeters, so it's still wrong. Anyways, but then obviously these sports become so important, so crucial for their life that they spend a lot of time there, they spend a lot of money in there, they become then businesses again, and they become rivalries. There's then aggression happening because it's so important that their team wins so they can feel happiness, and if the team loses then they feel sadness. But once they're away from the pitch where it's no longer socially acceptable to show their feelings, then that sadness again becomes violence, and that's how you then have people burning down cars, beating other fans up, drinking, taking drugs and everything just to cope with the feelings. They have no other outlet to deal with. It can also happen, as I've talked before in other episodes, there is a connection between our emotional well-being and our physical well-being. And when there's a lot of feelings cooped up inside of you that you have no outlet for, that men are not allowed to talk about or express, without having fear of being stigmatized, of being outed as weak and vulnerable, and then being shunned from their community, it can do something physically to you. And then men experience feelings in a very physical sense, where they then become very ill or become very have pain in certain areas, or have an illness and then express their feelings through that illness, which can be one of the reasons why the men flu, as it's called, is seen, where men then actually suffer and are, taking advantage of that allowed vulnerability, where, oh, I'm ill, I get to be vulnerable here because I'm ill, it's reasonable, it's not unmanly, to have someone take care of me for a short while I am in a state that is socially accepted to be vulnerable during. Of course, some of this is changing. We have, in some small areas, started to allow men to express their feelings. But sometimes also not really. Because on the one hand, yes, there's this area where men are now told and taught, hey, share your feelings, at least to your partner, share your emotions with them, share what you're feeling with them. But that can then, because not only did men grow up with this belief, and that's then being confirmed by the popular culture now when they're adults, that men don't show emotions, men are stoic heroes, they don't, there's no vulnerability, no weakness. But so did the partners, the men and women they live with then. So when they then open up, the partners may not be able to deal with it. It could, petrify them, or some women even say that now they're less attracted to their partner because it's not the man they used to date or be in a relationship with, or they're so overwhelmed by the fact, oh my God, there's so much in that person they didn't know about. There's such a richness of feelings and emotions that they can't deal with. On the one hand, reasonably, because it shouldn't just be the one person that gets everything. Men should be encouraged to not just share with their partner, but have other men or friends that they can share that with. But also because they're not used to it, that there's all of a sudden this openness they maybe craved, but then it's still not the man figure that they're the person's supposed to be, because the internalized belief that men should not be vulnerable kind of works against it. So it's like a double bind that men find themselves in there sometimes. So it's not just men that need to work on their ability to express their emotions. It is also their partners that need to work on on receiving that and being able to deal with that. And both parties then need to be able to set healthy boundaries. Otherwise, if the reaction from the spouse to the openness of the man is no, then the man will stop and will revert back to the old habits and feel again shit about themselves. Because, and I don't think I've said it enough in this episode, but men do have feelings. Men are sad, men are angry, men are vulnerable, men are ashamed, men fear not being good enough a lot. But, they're not allowed to talk about it. They crave, we crave being wanted. We crave being cared for. We crave caring for other people. We crave connectedness in both emotional and physical sense. We crave being seen, being taken, taken seriously, but also seen as a whole person, just like other people do, that we men often don't do to them because we're not allowed to do it, or because we feel like emotions are weak, so we don't allow other people to have that feeling either. This petrifying state that the partner feel sometimes can also happen to the man talking about their feelings. Sometimes, especially when the feelings are suppressed for a long time, once they start coming out, or they start, actually noticing them, it can be quite overwhelming. There's all of a sudden this richness of emotions, because man, just as women, there's no difference in the amount and the intensity of emotions and feelings that men and women feel. It's just the techniques, the learned techniques of being able to first recognize them, because not only are men not taught to talk about their feelings, they're also not taught to recognize what they're actually feeling. And because of the lack of interconnectedness, it can then also sometimes, take a while until, and that's what happens to me. I know I have a feeling, but it takes me a while to be able to talk about it, because I need first distinguish, recognize myself, what's going on there, before I can talk about it. Anyways, what was I saying? Yes, when they just learn to talk about it, it can be quite petrifying because there's this depth of emotions that they've been suppressing for so long. And because we've taught men to be stoic and to not feel, or at least to not show their feelings, then become very great at turning these emotions into something else that is usually very toxic, as I've said before. And it creates a cycle of toxic masculinity, because you are taught that way and you teach other people that way, or you're treated that way and then you treat other people that way. And then they do that, and so on and so on and so forth. And it takes a lot of effort, a lot of energy, and a lot of self work that we men need to do. We don't have anyone else to do it for us. We need to do this work, but we need also the society to break as well those ideas. But this toxic masculinity keeps on going and going and going and going. I do understand that nowadays, especially in this very strange political climate where everyone feels like the old traditional values are being attacked, some of them for very good reason though, that people get tired of hearing this term toxic masculinity. Oh my god, everything you do as a man is now toxic. And of course, no, you can be very manly and very masculine still, but still show your feelings and emotions. Why do they, why is there a why they're opposed, these two things? And there's other things that make a man manly, rather than, being a dick to other people or being, not talking about the feelings. You can still be taking care of other people. You can still be a solution finder, but talk about your feelings. You can still be the shoulder someone else can lean on, and lean on someone else's shoulder. We know that women are super strong and can do so many amazing things, and they talk about their feelings. So maybe that does go together with each other. And the less men or people in general talk about their feelings, the more isolated they feel, the more they lash out to other people. The health issues can stop. I mean, if you constantly tense of the feelings, you get headaches, and there's lots of inflammation happening, and it's just bad for you. And we have men die earlier from heart attacks because they, on the one hand, carry all that with them. On the other hand, they don't talk about when they're feeling bad, or they go to the doctor because they don't want to be weak. And then they die earlier, and then sometimes so early that the families they've created now have to cope without them, because it's unmanly to talk about your feelings. I mean, that's kind of fucked up, isn't it? So let's talk about our feelings. It's worth it, I think. Encouraging men to talk about their feelings and accepting men as beings that have emotions and feelings, and getting rid of this image that men cannot have feelings or aren't allowed to have feelings or shouldn't show their feelings is one thing. The other thing is for us men to learn to talk about our feelings. And there's many steps that need to be taken. First, it could be helpful to work on what sensations do you have in your body at any given time. So go inwards and just feel without necessarily talking to anyone about it. But just it helps to be self-aware. Hey, what's actually going on with me here? And before you share with other people, it's good to be able to know yourself. And some people need to talk about it first to be able to to get to the bottom of it. Okay, then start with talking. But other people need to first go in themselves and find what's happening. And maybe there's some bodily sensations that go along with certain feelings. For example, anxiety, or when I feel anxious, I have a very fast heartbeat. I have this very constraining a stomach feeling. It's like it's been pulling together. When I feel angry, I get a little bit of pounding in my head, and I can't breathe well. When I feel sad, I just feel very empty. I feel like stuff is no longer inside me. Yeah. And maybe that's also true for you. And sometimes it helps, okay, now being able to recognize, these bodily symptoms go along with certain feelings, and then next time when those bodily sensations come back up, you can already think, this is what it felt like when I was anxious. And then the next step could be, why am I anxious? Or this is when anger comes. Or what's behind this anger? That can then be the next step. So now you have already a connectiveness established between, this is this bodily sensation, so this is the feeling, so I no longer need to think long about what is this, what I'm feeling, and you can start thinking about what's with this, why is this happening, and how can I, in the next step then, how can I express this in a good way that doesn't hurt anyone, not you or anyone else. So to put words to the feelings. And it's because we have so long been under the impression that men cannot do this and women are basically born with it, we think that, it doesn't work once you didn't learn it, or once, if you're not born with it, you can't learn it. But of course you can learn it. Language, we learn, and we learn constantly. Language evolves. And our feelings, we learn to recognize them, and then we learn to express them. And just like anything else you learn, there needs to be practice and repetition involved, and it doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen by listening to one podcast episode. It doesn't happen by reading one article or one book. Those are good first steps. Those are great to be aware there is something that you can work on, and that you hopefully will be working on, because we all need to work on it. And once you've recognized your feelings, how they work and how you can express themselves, then that's also not the end of the journey. It's a continuous thing that happens forever and ever, which can seem like, oh my God, when will this, why? This just seems like so much effort. Is it actually worth it? Because, I'm actually quite happy now. And maybe you are. That's great. But there might be a time in your life when you're not. And maybe you are not happy, but just tell yourself that. I don't know. There's not an actual person standing here, so I'm not talking to anyone in particular. But learning to talk about your feelings, learning to talk about your emotions is not only good for you, it's good for your environment. It can be helpful in the future. It gives you the ability to be more in sync with yourself. And that's always good, because being in sync with yourself can have many, many positive effects on your physical and emotional well-being. But also, especially if you're a parent, it can be great to be able to do that, because then you can teach it to your children. And they can learn it from you by observation, or by, you telling them. And then they can teach their kids. And then that's how we create a society that is more attuned to their feelings, regardless of gender or sex. And isn't that a valuable goal trying to achieve? Nobody will do the work for us. And as long as we are not doing this work and being able to show our emotions in a healthy way, we still will have the feeling that the only way we're valuable is if we're the alpha males, because only if we are the best and successful are we actually worth anything, because otherwise we can't express our feelings. So we take up the space that other people need, and we can't give them the space that they deserve, because we feel that that's the only way we can be, of any worth. And that's not a good society to live in. And yeah, you at some point couldn't drive a car. Maybe you still can't, but if you can, then you've learned that. At some point you couldn't write. If you still can, you can still learn. And if you can do that, then if you can write, then you've learned it. And so you can learn other things like walking, talking, most things we can learn. There's only very few things that if we didn't learn them early on in life, we will never be able to learn them. But talking about your feelings and recognizing your emotions, fortunately, isn't one of them. So get talking. Talk to your spouse, talk to your friends, talk to your family. And if you can't talk to them or don't want to talk to them, you can always, of course, talk to me. You can talk to me anonymously by sharing your story on the anonymous contact form on the website. And also, if you want me to share that story anonymously, of course, just put that in there. You can message me on Instagram. You can email me. Instagram, the handle is MenTell Health _podcast. Email Tim at men-tell-health.com. That's also the website. And this is it for this week. Thank you so much for listening. And if you like this episode or this podcast in general, I would be super happy if you could rate and share this podcast. If you give it on any of the podcasting apps that you might be using, that where you can rate it a good review, only if you feel that way, of course, then that will be helpful to the algorithms there, our overlords, the algorithms, that they show this podcast to more people so they can hear it. And if you're on YouTube, the same goes for you. If you're not already subscribed, just click that button, give it a thumbs up, and if possible, share this episode. And post something in the comments that you feel about this podcast or this episode in particular. And this is it from me. As always, I see and I hear you, and I hope you hear and or see me again next week. Goodbye.